What is it, though, that makes this mountain beautiful? He goes on to say in verse 2 that it is beautiful in the height or the elevation, how tall it is, and it is the joy of all the earth. But why? I have never been to Jerusalem. My father went when I was a boy. He went with his dad. I've seen the pictures. Saying it's a mountain is one of those things that somebody who lives near, the Cascades or whatever. This is like when I moved to Virginia. They used to talk about the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And I thought, mountains? Do they have snow on them year-round? I don't think that counts. But the mountain of Jerusalem here is similar, right? It's not that tall. We're not talking the Himalayas or the Andes.
It was a mountain from the surrounding.
Sure.
Little foothills, barely tall foothills.
It is taller than the places surrounding it, but why speak of it this way? Again, with the superlative. We've talked about this as being God is deserving of the superlative, but now it is applied to the mountain, right? It's beautiful in its elevation, and it is the joy of all the earth, of the whole earth. How does that work with something that is not that big?
It's where the temple is.
It's where the temple is, yeah. The point is not that the mountain is so great, therefore God is dwelling there. But rather, God dwells there, and thus the mountain is so great. It is emphasizing the difference between these two things. In the pagan world roundabout, frequently, mountains were places that were considered holy, the dwelling of the divine, and frequently they would choose the highest mountain that they knew. That is where God would be. And this turns that formula on its head. This is not the highest mountain that they knew about. There were lots of taller, higher places. But this place was the place that God chose to be, and thus it was the greatest. It is the place where God dwells among men. And this is, again, works as an analogy looking forward to the coming of Christ. That the prophecy about the Messiah speaks of him not being exceptional in his appearance. Right? You can read that in Isaiah. And it is not the fact that he was the most powerful man in the world, commanding armies, that made him the great Savior of mankind, but rather that it was God as man, incarnate, humbling himself in order to save us, that made him so great. His divine nature, rather than his appearance or the attributes that he took to himself. Right? And in his human form, the human attributes. I don't want to say that his divine attributes were not great, because they were, but in a similar fashion, the mountain of Jerusalem is the great mountain because God is there. It is the place where God dwells, and therefore it is a place that brings joy, or will bring joy to all the earth. I mean, this is, again, somewhat forward-looking as well, right? Looking towards the eschaton, as we talked about last week, the week before, right? The end times, right? With the culmination of prophecy. But then comparing Zion, he moves on to compare Zion to, hopefully I pronounce this properly, we're close, Zaphon, which could also just mean the north, but there's a strong sense, I think, among most people translating that this is a proper noun, an actual name of a place.
Well, there's also at least one, I can't tell you the description, but talking about God or heaven being the true north. We went out 2 nights ago. I got to see the big sun flurry at 11:30 tonight. But Barb went to bed early, so I took her out last night. We looked in the exact same place. Didn't see it. But that place is north. So.
Yeah, the north would probably be referring to, if it was a generalized direction, there were mountains, much higher mountains to the north, in Syria and Lebanon than there were in Israel. And so the comparison of the mountain that God dwells on to the mountains of the north is one way of speaking about the greatness of it, even though it is not actually the tallest. It is tall or important, great, in the sense of what it is and what it is for, rather than its actual appearance, right? So the comparison between the great mountains that they knew of and the mountain where God dwelled, right? The greatness of it. But then as well, Zaphon was the name of the mountain that the chief of the Canaanite deities dwelt on. And the comparison here appears to be as well, perhaps, speaking of this as being the dwelling place of the true God. That the thing that they think they know, where the greatest of the gods dwells, is wrong, and that it is in fact Zion. It is the true mountain of God. The comparison perhaps is to drive this point home, that regardless of the actual physical stature of the mountain of Jerusalem, it is truly the great mountain where God dwells. Right? It's a further repetition of this idea that he has already developed. And the city of the great king, the dwelling place of the ruler of all, as he follows up. Verse 3 goes on to describe God as being the actual haven, right? He's elaborating and developing his point thematically. Jerusalem itself is not what makes the people secure. The actual physical walls of the city, the actual dimensions that it has, are not what secure the people. God himself is actually the refuge. God is the one that provides safety to the people of Jerusalem, to the people that follow him, not the actual physical surroundings that they have. 4 goes on to describe an invasion of foreign kings, and this is part of why some kind of translators and people that have studied this say that this is probably drawn from a specific event. There was the invasion of the Assyrians, which is the one I saw suggested most often, where they invade and they come up to Israel, and then they are driven back essentially by the intervention of God, his divine intervention, rather than the armies of Israel or any of their physical and military might is what defeats them. They are frightened away, in fact. But again, it doesn't have to be tied to that one event to serve as kind of a proxy for this concept generally. Jerusalem itself, is it an imposing city that would overawe conquerors? Again, I don't know if anybody's actually done that. Probably somebody. It's one person.
You know, it would be, it was in a specifically defensive position
Mm-hmm.
with walls. I mean, you could see for miles. So I don't know if it's talking about the city itself or its positioning and importance. I would say if you're talking about positioning and importance, yes.
But it is an important place for the nation of Israel, but it's not impregnable. Right? A number of different people conquered it. The Babylonians certainly did, took them away into exile. And then later Alexander came through, and he took over. And then the Romans, right? It was possible to do from a purely material kind of standpoint.
It wouldn't have been in any of those examples that you gave if God had been with his people.
And it was because God defended his people that made it impregnable when they could defeat greater armies, right? They would be invaded by people, by countries that were far more powerful, and they would be repulsed. They would be driven back. They would be saved through the divine power of God. Again, developing his theme and using the description of the city as a proxy, as a metonymy for who God is, the dwelling of God there and the actions of God. And this is I mean, we have, songs, hymns that we sing about this, about marching to Zion and things like that. And it's not about a specific place, right? And these stand in for the concepts and the ideas that we have about who God is and our devotion to God and our willingness to follow God that leads to then this safety, to this protection, to this refuge.
And even into our politics, going even into one of Reagan's speeches, the shining city on a hill.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't something that came out of somebody's fantasy. That really drew back to Jerusalem and where it was at one time.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of the use of figurative language to convey a much more kind of metaphorical idea of things, right? It's not, again, that he was trying to say that there would be a city in the U.S. that everybody could see all around the world, but rather that conceptually what we stood for, the things that we did, would be of note and worthy of people's attention. Yeah. Just that, anonymically to represent God. Thinking of these things then, the intervention that's spoken of in 5 seems to have been one that was an astonishing event. Something that was shocking. The kings assembled themselves, they passed by together, they saw it, then they were amazed, they were dismayed, they hasted away. It's non-specific. What is it that God does?
He defends it.
He defends them. He protects them. But what does he do exactly? How? It doesn't say. Why doesn't it say? Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is one of those examples of the way that Hebrew literature works that is often really, really frustrating to me and to a lot of other people from my cultural context. Right? They leave out the details that I want to know.
Josh said on the walls of Jericho, there was a lot of detail.
There was, but then you get other stories. For example, one of my favorite ones is where they're talking about a man, they were talking about where Elisha was buried. Who was Elisha? They're going to take a dead man, they're going to bury him, they're going to use the same cave to put him in. And as they're doing so, the foreign raiders come over the hill to attack their village or whatever. So everybody gets scared. So they take the guy and they just chuck him in and they run. And the minute his body lands on the bones of the prophet, he's brought back to life. He gets up. That's the end of the story. And we don't know who he is. And they don't tell you what happens next. And boy, howdy, I really would like to know the rest of that story. What did this man think? He was dead. Now he gets up. He walks out of the cave. There's a raid from the Assyrians or whoever going on outside. Like, that's got to be the most confusing moment. But we don't get any of this. And the whole point of not getting any of that is it's not relevant to the moral point of the story, which is how much that Elisha was favored by God such that his bones still communicated the power of God to raise the dead. That's the point. And so the rest of the things, the fun little details that surround that you would like to know about, they get pushed to the side. Because that's not going to be part of the main moral message. And in this psalm, what is it that God does exactly? That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. What's important is God terrifies and drives away the enemies of Israel. That's the point. Does he do it with a storm? Does he do it by smiting them with fire? Not important. What's important is that he does it. And so the extraneous detail, the interesting detail to my modern mind is left out of this so that they can keep that tight focus on what it is, the lesson they're trying to drive home.
It can't always be like that. The 153 fish, why did we need to know there were 153 fish again?
You're speaking of in the Gospels or this is one of those other things that's fun thinking about the differences between the Old Testament and the New. Shifting to a different mode of storytelling. from the more Hebrew way of telling literature and writing history to one that is more Greek.
Got it.
And you see some of those changes in the way that the writers themselves are culturally used to doing these things. For example, I think is it Luke's gospel is far more chronological, I believe, than Matthew's. Matthew, writing much more from, again, the traditional Jewish perspective, was not as concerned with that. Right? If you go back and you read the histories of the Kings and Chronicles, the way that they do their chronology is really confusing to the modern mind. Because they'll take one of the kings and they'll go to the end of his reign, and then they'll shift to the next kingdom, the other kingdom, and then they'll go back in time and talk about him to the end of his reign, and then they'll go over to the other kingdom and then start there, and they keep going back and forth in time. And it's
It's like the first 5 books of, or chapters of Genesis.
Mhm.
We go back to the beginning a couple of times.
Right. Because again, they were organizing it in a different way, with a different mindset, with a different purpose in mind that we think about when we record history. They do it differently. All right, I am only in verse 5. All right,
Oh, having fun.
that's good. I'm glad someone's having fun. The simile in verse 6 is an important one too. It speaks of a woman in labor to describe the situation of the people that God drives away. Right? They're astonished, they're amazed, they're dismayed, they hasted away. Trembling took hold of them there, pain as of a woman in travail. Or in modern words, of course, in labor. It describes both the intensity of what is occurring, the severity of their distress, but also the irresistible nature of it. When a baby is about to be born, there's things that modern medicine, I know, that can do to change the speed at which this occurs. But for a woman in that time and place, there was very little that could be done to stop that from happening. Once it had begun, you had to deal with it. It was irresistible. And comparing what God has put these enemies in is to say that both that they suffered, that it was an intense moment, and there was nothing that they could do about it. They were powerless before the power of God. There was no way to resist what he was doing. God was in control, and in his defense of his people, he cannot be defeated. The author is driving home the greatness of God again through a description of how the people that oppose him suffer. That those that go against him are powerless in his grip. Where is Tarshish? This is a trick question. I'll warn you now.
Seaport?
I'm sorry?
Seaport?
It is a seaport, yes. Must have been a seaport. But where?
On the Red Sea?
The Red Sea? Maybe. That's the trick, of course, is that no one's really sure. People have ideas. They'll make a case for certain places. Some people say Spain. Right? Southern coast of Spain near modern Gibraltar. Some people say Sardinia, closer to Italy, between Spain and Italy, in that northwestern part of the Mediterranean. Some people say places like the Red Sea, things like that. But no one's really sure. So, what is it about Tarshish, then, that we do know? There's a few things that make this reference to ships of Tarshish interesting. One is that it may have just been a description of the type of ship. They were big. They were known for being large vessels that were of significant power and size. And it may be a description that God is destroying or is able to destroy even the most powerful navies. That it is an almost effortless act, right? That he doesn't have to exert himself to destroy the most powerful of the seagoing peoples. But as well, it speaks of the distance, right, and the power of Tarshish, in that if these were really places from Tarshish, ships from that place, an invasion force, these were potentially related to the Phoenician peoples, people that founded the Carthaginian Empire. It was far away, and they would have had to travel to get to Israel. The ships in Solomon's time only came every 3 years. They brought him tribute, essentially, precious things, every 3 years. That seems to be some indication of how far away it was. If that's the case, and they were at the far end of the Mediterranean, the fact that they're destroyed by an east wind takes on an additional dimension, that it is blowing from Israel, from the direction of where Israel is, out into the Mediterranean to push them back as a defense against those that would come and invade. There's several different ways that this can be understood, and I'm not going to try and tell you that any one of them is necessarily more correct than another, but it speaks of their destruction by a wind that is sent by God to defend his people. Again, another kind of way that an invasion can occur and that God repels, he drives back. I also really like this. The east wind is symbolic of the action of God. There are other places where it talks about an east wind doing things in the Old Testament. Pharaoh has a dream that Joseph interprets. Everybody remember this? This is in Genesis. Pharaoh has a dream. What does he dream about? Do we remember?
The stalks of wheat.
Yeah, it's the stalks of wheat. People remember the cows. I always remember the cows. 7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows. Then the lean cows eat the fat cows. They don't get any bigger. I always like that one. That dominates my memory when I think about the story. But there's the stalks of wheat that do the same thing. The ones that are diminished are withered by an east wind. An east wind withers them up. God sends a famine that affects the whole world. The locusts, when they're escaping from Egypt in Exodus, are brought by an east wind to Egypt. The east wind blows, brings the plague of locusts, judgment on the Egyptians and on Pharaoh in particular, for his failure to let the Israelites go. After that, when they part the Red Sea, when God is parting the Red Sea so that they can escape from the power of the Egyptians, an east wind blows and separates the waters. In Jonah, he sails away from Israel to escape. Also going to Tarshish, interestingly enough, I believe. A storm arises, and it doesn't specifically say for the storm which direction the wind was coming from, but I think it's possible to infer that it was from the east. Because as they're leaving Israel, and the storm comes up, they try to row back to land, but the wind is too strong. And the wind, if you're rowing right into the eye of the wind, trying to get back to the land, the wind must be coming from the east. Later, when he goes to Nineveh, he sits down to watch what happens. The vine grows. The east wind is part of what withers it. There's other places as well. Isaiah speaks of an east wind as the judgment of God. Jeremiah does. Ezekiel, even in Job, the east wind is associated with God and his judgment and his actions. I think it is common enough that taking that here is a direct reference to God's action in defending Israel. Not just simply because it speaks of the east wind and God breaking the ships, but the fact that it is an east wind. It is symbolic of who God is and what God does. Moving on into 8, there's an emphasis on the present nature of God's work and their confidence on this. As we have heard, so we have seen in the city of Yahweh of hosts and the city of God. God will establish it forever. What does it mean, that first phrase? As we have heard, so we have seen. Okay, seeing is believing, yeah. What is the difference between hearing and seeing in their context specifically, right?
Hearsay and one's a witness.
Yes. Hearsay and witness. And these are all perfectly correct and very applicable. The point I was driving at with necessarily thinking about it in terms of the present and the past is that hearing is what God has done. This is the past. These are the lessons that we read from the law and from the stories of what God did for his people and bringing them out of Egypt, about the stories of God creating the world, right? They have heard. They have heard what God has done. But then it goes beyond that to not just hearing about what God has done in the past, God has done for their ancestors, God has done for others. They have seen it.
Proof positive.
It's proof positive, and it has happened now. It has happened for me. It has happened here in the present moment. We have heard about the past, we have seen it here in the moment, and then they look to the future. God will establish it, the city, forever. It speaks of the whole swath of time. They have heard what God has done in the past, they have seen what God has done in the present, and they know that God will establish his city and his people forever. It is the full continuity of time. It's not just a thing that we read about in the Bible. It is not just something that God did for a people in the olden days. It's not just something that God does for someone else. The emphasis is on it is in the past, it is in the present, it is in the future as well. It is something on which we can have confidence, something upon which we can depend. Well, I got almost roughly 2/3. There's a shift in 9, and we're not going to get to talk about a lot of this, but it goes from describing what God has done, right, and 8 kind of takes part of the shift as well, to moving to praise of who God is. And it's going to change the way that it talks about, right, that God has defended his people, that he has broken this army, that he has destroyed these ships, and then speaking of God's nature and what God is doing. But I am past my time. So, thoughts, comments, questions, anything that I didn't get to, somebody wanted to mention or ask about, something that I moved past too quickly that we need to go back to and talk about for a moment? I haven't seen any small children yet, so we've still got a few moments if somebody is, but I hear them coming. All right, well, we will move on to Psalm 49 next week, but I appreciate everybody's time and attention this morning. Thank you very much.